I want to give a quick welcome to those who are now joining us on Zoom. We expect today's program to start about 3 o'clock, maybe a couple minutes later, but roughly 3 o'clock. So use this time that you have to check your audio. If you can hear me, you're all set. Also find the QA button on your screen, either the top or the bottom of your screen on Zoom, and you can use that for any time during the presentation where you want to enter your question, or you could wait till the end to enter your question. And we usually get to all of the questions entered on Zoom, so please take advantage of that. And we hold all the questions until the end of the program. So make yourselves comfortable. The formal remarks should run about 50 minutes today, 50 minutes. So get comfortable, get a glass of water, and I'll be back with you in just a couple minutes.
It's actually about 5 miles from here. Close. Most of the dogs, a lot of the dogs live over there. You were medical director at Shop. And then he said he was the CEO.
It's just 3 o'clock. We have a few people getting seated here at the museum. Be back with you in a minute.
It's tough for all the hospitals out there now. I mean, it's not involved, I see it. I still talk to quite a few folks. You know, my critical care their physician practice.
I don't know the surgeons. International.
Yeah. I know you would Chaco, Amazon.
I was talking to someone, which hospital was that today, saying the problem is inflation is like 8%. Yeah. Hospitals can't raise their prices.
And I'll wait for you to tell me.
Yeah, they do. And we were along a couple of big highways, you know, the trauma center designation, training all the primary care of the primary responders. And so,
We're about to begin our program. Good afternoon. My name is Eileen McIntyre, Chair of the Education Committee for the Hingham Historical Society. Welcome to the third program in the Hingham Historical Society's 2022-2023 lecture series titled Native Homelands, Settler Colonialism. We will first hear from Deirdre Anderson, Executive Director of the Hingham Historical Society.
Thank you, Eileen. Welcome everyone here in person. And for those who are online, we have about 38 people joining us on Zoom today. So what a treat. This is our last event of 2022. So simultaneously doing a little dance and also saying profound thanks. It's been quite a year for us at the Hingham Historical Society, and we couldn't have done the outreach and the community engagement and the programs that we have done this year without your support. So I thank all of you very much. We have big plans for 2023. So we hope you will stay with us. And of course, it wouldn't be my opening remarks if I didn't say it is that season of giving. And if you haven't already given generously to the Hingham History Fund, we would appreciate that. I'm sure you have received emails or solicitations from us. On Tuesday morning, you will see our friends, the Hannons, live on celluloid. They're going to they have generously served in a video that we are going to send out to you. So you get to enjoy that over your coffee on Tuesday morning. So, but with sincere thanks for all your support, for all that we do here at the Hingham Heritage Museum, the Old Ordinary, and the Benjamin Lincoln House. I wish you the happiest holidays, and thank you for joining us here for today's lecture.
And thanks so much, Deirdre, for all you do for the Historical Society and for our town. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. David S. Jones, the A. Bernard Ackerman Professor of the Culture of Medicine at Harvard University. Dr. Jones earned his PhD in the history of science at Harvard University and his MD from Harvard Medical School. I believe he got those degrees simultaneously. Today, as a professor, Dr. Jones engages his students at Harvard College and Harvard Medical School in the history of medicine, medical ethics, and social medicine. In his research, Dr. Jones focuses on the causes and meanings of health inequities, as well as the history of decision-making in cardiac therapeutics. Dr. Jones' published work includes Rationalizing Epidemics, Meanings and Uses of American Indian Mortality Since 1600, which was published in 2004. And this is the topic he will be talking to us about today. He is currently at work on 4 histories: the evolution of coronary artery surgery, the history of heart disease and cardiac therapeutics in India, the threat of air pollution to health in India, and the history of air pollution research in the United States. The formal program today will run about 50 minutes, and we will then have time for questions. and answers with both our in-person audience, a really nice group here at the museum today, and our Zoom audience members. Thank you, Dr. Jones, for being part of the Native Homeland Settler Colonialism lecture series, and we are honored to welcome you here to the Hingham Heritage Museum this afternoon.
Well, thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to have the chance to speak with you for the people who are here in person and for those of you who are also here on Zoom. I know this is a busy time of year on everyone's calendar, and so it's great that you were able to take out this time on a Sunday afternoon. It's a bit of a somber topic to talk about epidemics, especially in the midst of an epidemic. But there are times when I think this kind of historical insight can be valuable for us as we go through the crisis that we are in now. So as many of you know, the devastation of American Indian populations that followed European arrival in the Americas is one of the most devastating events in the history of human populations. Exact numbers aren't known and will likely never be known, but it's certainly the case that tens of millions of people died in the first century after Europeans arrived. Populations by 1600 were 50 to 90% lower than they were in 1500. As historian John Murren has described, early America was a catastrophe, a horror story, not an epic. And the consequences of this can clearly be seen for any of you who have traveled around the world today. Anyone who has been in China and East Asia will mostly find people who are Chinese or of East Asian ancestry. And anyone who goes to South Asia or Africa will mostly see people of South Asian or African ancestry. But if you travel around to the Americas, especially in North America, most of the people you will see are of European and African ancestry. Although there are plenty of American Indians who have survived, but something clearly different, something catastrophic happened in the Americas, unlike in other parts of the world. And because of the enormity of this event, it has gotten much attention from historians, from archaeologists, and from popular writers. Nearly every survey course of American history that is taught in high schools or colleges will say something about these epidemics that took place after Europeans arrived. Unfortunately, a lot of what gets taught and gets written has been misleading and is sometimes just patently false. And it continues to be a part of the popular narrative about the history of this country. And so this afternoon, I'll describe three of the stories that are often told about these encounters. That Indians died in great numbers because they had no immunity to European diseases. That these Indians were demoralized and powerless in the face of the epidemics. And this led them to abandon their religious practices, their political leaders, and their cultures. And that the mortality was largely celebrated by European colonists, especially English colonists. And as I will show, there are aspects of truth in each of these stories, but also much that is just not true at all. Indians were not susceptible to European diseases because of genetic liabilities, but because of the conditions of colonization that they found imposed on themselves. There are many Indian societies that exhibited impressive resilience in the face of the European onslaught. And while many writers did thank God for killing the Indians, and as you'll see, that was pervasive in the early rhetoric in Massachusetts, you can also find examples of English settlers responding with compassion and care to the Indians they encountered here. And so the experiences of encounter were incredibly complex, and it's important for us to get this story correct, to understand as accurately as possible as what happened. Not just for the sake of having as good a historical understanding as is possible, but because many of these aspects of health and cultural encounter remain very relevant today. And the ways we respond to the crises in health we face today are often shaped by the stories that we tell about the past. So getting these past stories correct remains very relevant for us now. And so I'll start off with this question of what exactly happened to the indigenous populations of New England and why. And so there's certainly no doubt that Indian populations, the native populations here, suffered terribly after their encounter with the Europeans and the English. The English began exploring the coasts of New England in the early 1600s and 1610s, well before the settlers arrived in Plymouth. And a major epidemic struck the Massachusetts coast between 1616 and 1619. Thomas Dermer, who sailed along the coast of Massachusetts in the summer of 1619, wrote, quote, "I passed along the coast and found some ancient plantations not long since populous, but now utterly void." So he was describing abandoned Indian villages along the coastline. William Bradford, who arrived famously in 1620, saw the consequences of this. He wrote, "The people, not many, being dead and abundantly wasted in the late great mortality. Their skulls and bones were found in many places, lying still above the ground, where their houses and dwellings had been, a very sad spectacle to behold." Robert Cushman visited the fledgling colony in Plymouth the following summer, in the summer of 1621. As he wrote in his letters, "Between the epidemic and the own wars amongst the indigenous groups, I think the 20th person is scarce left alive." And that quotation is often the source of these claims that 95% of the population had died. It's a very thin evidence base for such a dramatic claim. And the exact numbers are not known and will probably never be known, but you can make reasonable estimates. Many archaeologists will guess that the Indian population of New England or Southern New England was around 70 or 100,000 people in 1600, but had decreased down to about 10,000 by 1700. So dramatic population loss over that century. Meanwhile, the English population, we know this number clearly, was 0 in 1600, but by 1700, the estimated population of Massachusetts and their affiliated colonies was about 100,000. So the population trajectories are almost inverted. As I said, the exact numbers are imperfect, but the trajectories, the competing trajectories of these are clear. Now, whenever you see a population decline like this, it can be hard to tell how much of that is direct mortality, how much of that is migration away from English colonization, how much of it is the English not paying attention to these other populations or people being absorbed into the population. So there are many sources of ambiguity. But the trajectory is clear. If you had been here in 1600, you would have seen Massachusetts entirely inhabited by indigenous populations. And if you traveled the state, especially Eastern Massachusetts in 1700, you would mostly have encountered the English. And the trajectory, these divergent trajectories were recognized at the time and often described with language that many of us would now take great offense at. So Cotton Mather, famous or infamous member of the Mather family, wrote in his history, "The woods are almost cleared of those pernicious creatures to make way for a better growth," meaning the English. Thomas Hutchinson, who was a historian and governor of Massachusetts before the American Revolution, was so impressed by the disparate trajectories of these two populations that he abandoned his usual skepticism of Puritan mythology and wondered if maybe this actually was an example of divine providence. He wrote, "Our ancestors supposed an immediate interposition of providence in the great mortality among the Indians to make room for the settlement of the English. I am not so inclined to credulity, but should we not go into the contrary extreme if we were to take no notice of the extinction of this people in all parts of this continent? They waste, they molder away, they disappear." Now that kind of language has been picked up by historians for centuries. And they conclude that there must have been some sort of unusual epidemiological mechanism to explain how the populations of the indigenous communities collapsed, even as the populations of the English grew. And this is often taken form of what has been called the theory of virgin soil epidemics. And historian Alfred Crosby was not the first person to come up with this idea. The idea had circulated for decades, but he offered one of the most famous accounts of this theory in 1976. As he wrote, "Virgin soil epidemics are those in which the populations at risk have had no previous exposure with the diseases that strike them and are therefore immunologically almost defenseless." This idea has circulated widely. Francis Jennings was a very prominent left-wing historian, in general, wrote quite progressively about the indigenous populations of the Americas and quite scathingly about the European colonial project. Even he wrote, "Indeed, if there is any truth to the biological distinctions between the great racial stocks of mankind, the Europeans' capacity to resist certain diseases made them superior in the pure Darwinian sense to the Indians who succumbed." And this has taken its most famous and recent manifestation in the work of Jared Diamond, which I suspect many of you have encountered. This book remains a fixture of the middle school curriculum in Massachusetts. I had to have long conversations with both my children as they were forced to watch the movie based on this book. Diamond writes, "The main killers were old world germs to which the Indians had never been exposed and against which they therefore had neither immune nor genetic resistance." And he has an elaborate theory for how you can account for this differential susceptibility. Now, the basic problem here is the mere repetition of a claim does not make it true, something we see in American politics today. Diamond's claim that the Indians had neither immune nor genetic resistance is a ludicrous one. They are humans. Humans have immune systems. All mammals, all vertebrates have had immune systems for hundreds of millions of years. And yet someone can write this and win the Pulitzer Prize. And so that if you look more closely at this whole explanatory apparatus, the theory of virginal epidemics, it makes four basic claims. That many Indians died, that most of the mortality came from epidemics, that many of these epidemics were new ones introduced by the Europeans that American populations hadn't previously exposed. And this lack of prior exposure left them vulnerable such that they died in great numbers, even as the English and European populations managed to thrive in the Americas. Now, again, there are lots of ambiguities here. As I said, it's not clear how many died and how quickly they died. The numbers are clearly substantial. Whether it's 50% or 90%, that is still a horrific level of mortality. This country has been greatly shaken by the COVID pandemic. It's like less than 1% mortality. I can't imagine what it would be like to be in a community that experienced 50% mortality. Epidemics clearly took place. The writings of early Massachusetts are full of accounts of what we would now most likely identify as smallpox or measles. The word plague was often used. No one thinks it was actually bubonic plague. That was just the word that was used. And there were likely countless others that were there. And many of these would have been new pathogens. There are a variety of reasons why things like smallpox, measles, and influenza had emerged in the old world populations of Europe, Asia, and Africa, and do not seem to have existed in the Americas before Europeans arrived. But one of the questions there is that no one knows what share of the mortality they actually caused. Like when Cushman says that 95% or a 20th of the population is scarce left alive, there are many things that could have caused that population decline. Infant mortality would have been very high, as it's been in all pre-modern populations. Interpersonal violence was high. Many of these communities were engaged in hostilities with neighboring groups. Migration would have caused a population to disappear from the point of view of the English, but without actually reflecting mortality of the people who were involved. But the claim that I've been most interested in is this last one, this notion that the lack of prior exposure is what left the Indians so susceptible and created this vulnerability to epidemics. Again, if you go through this literature, you can find very different specific claims, or many specific claims for how this happened. Sometimes they'll say that the indigenous communities must have lacked some resistance gene that Europeans had, that they had some kind of general immunodeficiency, that they were genetically more homogeneous than other human populations. I don't have time to go through all of these explanations here, so I'll focus on two of the most common ones. So one is this notion that because they hadn't been exposed to these diseases before, they lacked some kind of genetic protection that Europeans had gotten from natural selection based on their long exposure with these diseases. And there are some cases where this clearly is known to happen. So human populations long exposed to malaria have developed certain forms of genetic resistance, whether that's sickle cell trait or thalassemia. And these genetic traits do confer modest protection against a disease like malaria. And so based on that, it might make sense to think that Europeans would have had some resistance to pathogens that they had been long exposed to. There's no problem with that idea in theory. But the fact that a theory makes sense does not make it true. It turns out there is no active resistance, that European populations have any kind of resistance to smallpox that other humans do not have. And if someone were to release smallpox into Europe or North America, it would cause a total disaster. And so this notion that Europeans had something that American Indians didn't have is a nice story, but again, there's zero evidence that it's actually true. And now the most recent evidence suggests that smallpox only reached Europe either in late Roman times or possibly as late as the 12th or 13th century. And if that's true, Europeans had only been exposed to smallpox for 200 or 300 years before moving to the Americas, and that's just not sufficient time for any kind of evolutionary mechanism to confer some kind of resistance. The truth is, Europeans and their descendants are enormously susceptible to smallpox. just like all other humans are. Another theory that gets a lot of attention is this notion that many of these viral diseases, smallpox, influenza, measles, are often less deadly if you get them when you're a child. And it's really when the adults who are exposed to these diseases often have higher mortality rates. It's certainly true for disease like chickenpox and also true for disease like smallpox. And the idea was with these diseases, you're exposed as a child, and exposure would have been ubiquitous in a European city in the 17th or 18th century. 10% of the children in London would have died from smallpox, but everyone who survived would then have been immune to the disease for life. Whereas when these viral diseases showed up as new diseases in the Americas, no one had had prior exposure. The adult populations would have been encountering these viruses for the first time. And so you can imagine that mortality rates would have been very high. It would have been compounded by the fact that a lot of people in the community would have been sick at the same time because, again, the population was being exposed for the first time. I think that's a possible mechanism that might indeed have happened. But again, it raises this question is, well, what % of the deaths were actually caused by diseases like smallpox, measles, chickenpox that have this property, that are mostly childhood diseases that confer lifelong immunity? Now, if you look at society, or if over the course of the 20th century, as physicians have looked at societies that lived in developing countries and in settings of rural poverty, you can find these populations did have very high mortality rates. But a lot of that mortality, especially the child mortality, is coming from non-specific viral and bacterial diseases, strep throat, staphylococcal skin infections. There are countless respiratory viruses that many of us encounter each year. There are plenty of viruses that cause diarrhea. Most of these diseases don't cause lifelong immunity. You can get strep throat over and over again if you're unlucky enough to do so. And this notion that Europeans would have had resistance to these diseases that Indians didn't have, just again, is not justified by the historical record or the medical record. So there are some diseases for which these mechanisms are true. It's not clear if these were the dominant diseases at the moment of the encounter. And so as I said, while virgin soil theory is an interesting theory, there's no robust evidence that it's actually true. And more importantly, there's no need to invoke this theory to explain what happened during the colonial encounter. So as I had said earlier, the rough estimate is that populations in the Americas declined by 90% in the first century after European contact. And so if you were going to say they had 90% population loss over 1 year, you would need a really dramatic mechanism to account for that. But to get 90% mortality over a century, I want to say you only, sounds like a callous thing to say, but 2% mortality maintained over a century will produce 90% mortality by the end of that century. And it's actually not very hard if you have a population that is struggling to survive in difficult conditions of pre-modern New England or the Americas, to push a population from marginal subsistence into a 2 or 3% annual population loss. And it turns out when archaeologists have looked at what conditions were like in the Americas before Europeans arrived here, conditions were often quite marginal. Populations in the Americas had already been in decline. As far as archaeologists can tell, there were more Americans in 1400 than there were in 1490. So the populations were living on edge of baseline. Life expectancy was quite low as 15 to 17 years in some populations in the Southwest. And any disruption to a population like that could easily have had pushed a population from marginal subsistence into population decline. And so the question is, well, is there anything that Europeans did that might have pushed these populations from marginal subsistence into decline? And the answer is yes, they did all sorts of things that were terrible to the populations they encountered. There was loss of land, most obviously. All the land that the Europeans settled on was land that was taken from the people who had previously lived here. They did all sorts of things to disrupt subsistence of these communities. As you'll hear from one of the later speakers, they often let their livestock run free. To the extent that the Indians were farming lands, they had no reasons to put fences around their cornfields because there hadn't been any cattle or sheep or things that were going to eat all these deer fields, all the cornfields, and they were hunting the deer. And so all of a sudden, the Indian farms were overrun by English livestock. There are endless lawsuits about this, but again, you'll hear about this later on. There was a lot of forced labor and enslavement of Indians about here and throughout the Americas. There was active warfare, the Pequot War in 1636, King Philip's War in the 1670s. And so there were many, many things that the English did in the first decades of colonization that had a dire impact on the subsistence of the indigenous communities who had been here first. And so it's easy to imagine how the chaos of colonization destabilized the populations, leading to slow, steady population loss. All of these mechanisms that would have increased mortality would also have decreased fertility, making it difficult for these populations to replace their numbers. And so you can explain this decline perfectly well without having to invoke the genetic and somewhat racist theories of virgin soil epidemic. And there is actually a fair amount of evidence that this explanation that's based on the conditions of colonization actually is the correct explanation. And that's because the outcomes of encounter varied enormously from place to place. In some populations, the indigenous populations went extinct or went nearly to extinction. You can see this in the Caribbean, you can see this in Argentina. Most populations declined substantially, and again, significantly. I'm not trying to downplay the population losses. A place like Mexico, which has had the highest indigenous populations, again, lost 90% over a century, but then those populations began to recover starting around 1600. And then there were a few populations that actually experienced steady population growth after European encounter, at least initially. The Navajo is the most striking example in what's now the United States. They benefited enormously from the introduction of sheep and goats into Arizona and New Mexico. And so their populations grew steadily from the 1500s until 1860s, when at the end of the Civil War, the federal government sent the US military to subdue the Navajo populations. And then you see a population crash. And in many cases, the largest epidemics that took place, for instance, in the southeastern United States or in the southwestern United States, only began a century after contact. And so the populations had been interacting for 100 years. And it's only when the nature of that colonial encounter shifted that you see the devastating mortality amongst the American Indian populations. And so it was the intrusion of the Europeans and not any problems with Indian immunity that left these populations so susceptible. And so this raises the question that I've been interested in as a historian, is why is it that the theory of virgin soil epidemics still persists? And you can still see this being taught in schools, getting published in reputable newspapers. On the one hand, I think it's an appealing theory for people of European descent, like myself, because it absolves or seems to absolve Europeans of responsibility. Diamond basically says the die was cast before Columbus arrived in the Americas. The two human communities were going to meet, and the minute they met, the Americans were doomed because of all the things that Diamond describes. And on the other hand, it also absolves indigenous societies of responsibility. And so you'll see historians writing that these people had robust, capable societies, and they would have been able to put up a valiant resistance to the Europeans, except that their societies were destroyed because of the susceptibility to disease, which was no fault of their own. Again, as I said, just because a theory would be nice if it were true does not make it true. The explanations that we give for historical facts are rarely neutral, objective interpretations of facts, but they're often arguments that we make, and the arguments often serve direct political purposes. In this case, virgin soil epidemics, virgin soil theory emphasizes the ways in which disease was seen as an inevitable natural biological force, when in fact the mortality of the Indians reflects decisions that we made about how to structure society and how to structure the colonial encounter. And I would argue that historians need to be very careful with the explanations they give, because the things that they emphasize about history have clear political stakes with how we understand what happens today. I want to transition to the second part of all of this. And this is really the second pillar of virgin soil theory, which is that the horror of the epidemics that were suffered by the indigenous communities led to the demoralization and collapse of many of these societies. And again, there are many descriptions of this phenomena that have led to this idea circulating widely. The English colonists wrote often about how epidemics inspired the Indians and Eastern Massachusetts to convert and accept Christianity. Now, of course, the English were here in part to missionize, to convert these Indians, and so these were often self-serving accounts, but you'll find the accounts over and over again. So for instance, during the epidemic of smallpox in 1633, one of the first major epidemics to move off the coastline into the interior of New England. Again, it's an epidemic that started amongst the English. It's not that English were immune to these diseases, but they had these diseases and the diseases spread into the neighboring indigenous communities. But in December 1633, almost exactly to this day, Winthrop writes, John Sagamore, the Massachusetts leader at Winnisimmett, which is now Chelsea, suffered from smallpox. He promised, if he recovered, to live with the English and serve their God. Winthrop notes that many others followed this lead. Diverse of them in their sickness confessed that the Englishman's God was a great God and that if they recovered, they would serve him too. And so the early writings of the English in Massachusetts are full of these conversion narratives following these epidemics. Other Indians, other indigenous groups seeing no hope at all, according to the accounts that survive written by English, committed suicide in the depths of their despair. Accounts are especially grim during an epidemic of smallpox that struck the upper Missouri River Valley in 1837 and 1838. As one of the fur traders described, the indigenous people began to arrive at the fort with melancholy accounts of the ravages of disease, and their terror and despair were without bounds. A great many of them committed suicide at the first symptoms, stabbing themselves with their weapons or throwing themselves into the streams, preferring a speedy death to the lingering one of such a disease. And again, there are countless examples that makes very difficult reading. And historians have picked up on these accounts of despair and demoralization. Crosby, as I said, the historian most famous for the theory of emergent epidemics, wrote that American Aborigines were subjected to an immense barrage of disease, and their customs and religions provided little to help them through the ordeal. And in these accounts, the indigenous people are described as hapless victims, the religious leaders unable to stop the epidemics, leading the communities to abandon their faith, their beliefs, and their practices, and some even abandoned their own lives. And again, while there are accounts where this does seem to have happened, there are also other accounts that describe very different reactions to these epidemics. And this narrow focus on these grim outcomes doesn't do justice to the creativity and resilience of many of the indigenous groups. Paul Kelton, who's now a historian at Stony Brook University on Long Island, is an expert on the history of the Cherokee in the 18th century. And as he describes in this terrific book, Cherokee religious leaders developed all sorts of explanations that fit smallpox into their existing disease theories. They weren't baffled by this disease. They studied the disease and fit it into their existing frameworks that they had. And their explanations would have included spirits, witchcraft, taboo violations, other disruptions of the supernatural order. But they also had mechanistic explanations of disease, as most other humans did. And they developed a variety of herbal remedies and healing ceremonies to help restore both physical and spiritual order in response to this disease. Cherokee leaders also developed a reasonable set of pragmatic advice. They knew that if there were reports of smallpox in a British town, that you should steer clear of that town. They practiced quarantine when smallpox struck their own groups, and they employed a wide range of herbal remedies to help nurse people through their episodes of disease. All of these practices, the quarantine, the treatment, the self-isolation, provided a sense of control. And the leaders were often able to preserve their roles as respected priests, counselors, and healers, even in the midst of these dire epidemics. And so as Kelton concludes, Native Americans were capable of responding creatively to epidemics and avoiding complete physical and spiritual destruction. Now you might say, was there something exceptional about the Cherokee? In this case, the thing that's exceptional is how well documented Cherokee history is. It allows Kelton to reconstruct these detailed narratives. We don't have similar records from 17th century Massachusetts. There are oral histories, but the written records isn't as dense. And so it's harder to know exactly what happened here. And then the last item I want to talk about is the response by the colonists to this mortality. And again, historians have long described how the early Puritan colonists of Eastern Massachusetts celebrated the mortality they witnessed amongst the indigenous communities in the Massachusetts, the Wampanoag, and the other groups. In one of the first thorough reviews of these early epidemics written in 1909 by Herbert Williams, he wrote, "In their books and their tracts, we often find the epidemic regarded as the method by which Providence removed the savages to make room for Englishmen in general and for Puritans in particular. Crosby, writing for a more popular audience for American Heritage in 1978, wrote what seemed cosmically appalling to the Indians was interpreted as clear proof of God's love by the Pilgrims. David Stannard, who wrote a dire condemnation of the European colonial project, described how the devastation was a Golgotha the Puritans delighted in discovering. So you'll see this all over the historical literature. And again, there is considerable evidence that would support this idea that the English were happy to see this mortality and they interpreted it as God's blessing of their mission. And so despite my impulses to revise some of these histories, you can't hide from all of the facts that are in this record. So for instance, King James I granted a charter for the Council of New England. This was a group that came to nothing. This wasn't the Massachusetts Bay Company. This was an earlier effort to send colonists here in November 1620. And he wrote in his charter, so endorsing this effort to settle Massachusetts, there hath by God's visitation reigned a wonderful plague in a manner to the utter destruction, devastation, and depopulation of that whole territory. We, in our judgment, are persuaded and satisfied that the appointed time is come in which Almighty God in his great goodness and bounty towards us and our people hath thought fit and determined that those large and goodly territories, deserted as it were by their natural inhabitants, should be possessed and enjoyed by such our subjects and people. So a clear vision of divine providence blessing the English settlement of Massachusetts. 9 years later, as the leaders of what became the Massachusetts Bay Company were preparing to depart, the leaders, John Winthrop and others, and again, these were lawyers who had trained at Cambridge University, realized essentially that they were up to no good, that they were taking land that was already inhabited by humans. And so they prepared a series of legal briefs to justify why they thought they were entitled to do so. And so one of the many reasons that Winthrop gives is that he has, what warrant have we to take that land which is and has of a long time been possessed by other sons of Adam? He offers several answers, including God hath consumed the natives with a miraculous plague, whereby a great part of the country is left void of inhabitants. He arrives in 1630, survives the smallpox epidemic of 1633, and when he saw the aftermath of this epidemic, it reaffirmed his faith. As he wrote in a letter in May 1634, for the natives, they are near all dead of the smallpox, so as the Lord hath cleared our title to this place. Thomas Gorges, who spent 2 frustrating years in Maine on the Maine coast as the deputy of his cousin, wrote, the Indians are tractable. The Lord sent his avenging angel and swept the most part away. So they said there was no doubt that this kind of thinking was front and center. This kind of logic was front and center in the thinking of many of these English colonists in early New England. But there is no doubt that these same colonists had some very different thoughts at the same time. And you can find some examples of the English responding with care and compassion to the suffering that they witnessed. I mentioned Robert Cushman earlier. He was the one who described 95% mortality. He visited Plymouth during the second year of the colony. As he described in December 1621, the English often provided aid to the local Wampanoag when any of them are in want, as they so often are in the winter. When their corn is done, we supply them to our power and have them in our houses, eating and drinking and warming themselves up. So again, it's a description of 2 groups of humans who were responding helpfully and charitably towards each other. Edward Winslow, who was Bradford's second in command for Plymouth Colony, was called to pay respects to Massasoit in 1623 when word had spread that Massasoit lay dying in his home. Winslow arrived, spoke to Massasoit. It's not clear if he examined him in any way, and concluded that Massasoit's main problem was actually just constipation. And as he describes, he concocted a broth of strawberry and sassafras, gave that to Massasoit, provided some nursing care, and Massasoit recovered. And many historians credit the unusually long duration of good relations between the Plymouth colony and the Wampanoag was gratitude of Massasoit for Winslow's care during his illness. The most striking examples come during the epidemic of 1633 and 1634. Again, a terrible epidemic of smallpox starts in Plymouth, spreads as far west as Huronia, with now Ontario and Quebec, upstate New York, and throughout New England. During that year, in November, December 1633, Winthrop describes how, quote, when their own people, he's writing about the Massachusetts, when their own people forsook them, the English came daily and ministered to them. Mr. Maverick of Winnipsemet is worthy of a perpetual remembrance. He, his wife, and his servants went daily to them, ministered to their necessities, and buried their dead, and took home many of their children, and so did other of the neighbors. Now, Mr. Maverick did get a perpetual remembrance. The Maverick stop on the Blue Line is named for him, but I don't think anyone who has ever been through that Blue Line station has any idea what his role was in the early history of Massachusetts. Plymouth, meanwhile, had opened a trading post near Windsor on Connecticut. And if you look at the brochure for this flyer, you see Windsor just north of Hartford on the Connecticut River. Bradford describes, and he wasn't there himself, so he must have received letters from the Plymouth colonists who are at Windsor. He said, though at first they were afraid of the infection, yet seeing there of the local indigenous groups in Connecticut, seeing their woeful and sad condition and hearing their pitiful cries and lamentations, they had compassion on them and daily fetched them wood and water and made them fires, got them victuals while they lived, and buried them when they died. And so this lays a puzzle for historians. How do we account for, or how do we interpret these radically different reactions to these epidemics that struck the indigenous communities of Massachusetts and elsewhere? I have found and described some of these examples of compassionate responses in which the English went out to provide care. These are rare in the record. So one question comes up, are they rare because they were unusual? Or are they rare because they were so routine that they often did not deserve comment in the records that survive? Or are they rare simply because most of the records from this time have been lost and all we have are a few scraps that were preserved? I certainly do not intend to romanticize the era. The colonial encounter was characterized by countless forms of violence, physical violence, sexual violence, land theft, enslavement. But we are left with something of a puzzle. How do we understand a people who, on the one hand, were writing about this epidemic as if it were divine punishment and a blessing of the English mission in Massachusetts, but we're also we're also motivated to provide nursing care in the midst of a very gruesome epidemic. And if you look at some of Bradford's accounts of the smallpox epidemic, it was really horrifying. So you have these colonists who are simultaneously exemplifying both the best and worst of human nature. So you can always say, well, humans are complex. We often act with conflicting motives. The fact that the Puritan settlers offered providential explanations for what happened is no surprise. They offered providential explanations for everything that happened in all aspects of their lives, both routine and extraordinary. Providence protected them from danger. It brought rain when they prayed. It punished the wicked. It could strike down the blessed. If you read the journals of Bradford or Winthrop, you will find providence on every page describing every kind of event that happened. But that was not the only part of their explanatory system. They were also obsessed with the natural world and natural mechanisms. There are all these fascinating accounts from the work of John Eliot and Thomas Mayhew, who were some of the first missionaries working with the Massachusetts. And as they would go into these communities to try to explain the virtues of the New Testament, they would often get engaged in these question and answers with the Indians who were trying to test the overall value of English knowledge. And so they would ask them, why is the water in the lakes fresh and the water in oceans saltier? Or why are cranberries sour? And you can see these missionaries getting very frustrated because they had no good answers for these things. They would ask them to explain the tides. Explaining the tides was one of the great debates of 17th century English natural philosophy. They couldn't do it. And so you can see them struggling to answer these questions from these curious and inquisitive would-be converts. And the other thing that always comes up is when you see these statements, like when you see Winthrop saying that Maverick is worthy of a perpetual remembrance. or when you see these people who again, they would often be worried that they themselves would get sick. So when they went into indigenous homes to provide treatment, they perceived themselves as taking on some risk as they did so. Now, did they provide care because they genuinely cared about these other people? Did they provide care because they saw this as their Christian obligation and wanted to demonstrate to these communities what Christians would do as part of the sales pitch to convince these people to convert to Christianity? For many of these people, and especially in these first generations, they subscribe to a particularly intense form of Calvinist Puritanism, where predestination was the rule of the day. The die had been cast about whether or not you were saved before you were born, and no act that you did during your life would change that fate. That fate was predestined to you. And so they were obviously very curious. How can you tell if you have been predestined to go to heaven or not? And often what you will see in their writing is, well, people who had been predestined would act in a certain way. Like you wouldn't go out and murder someone. If you'd murdered someone, you were not the kind of person who had been predestined to be saved. But maybe if you went out and provided charitable care to people who were sick, that might be a clue that maybe you had been the kind of person who had been saved. And so maybe all this nursing care that they were providing was some kind of self-serving psychological reassurance. We really have no idea. It's incredibly frustrating. There were many, many things that could have been going on, and we just don't know. And so by way of conclusion, I'll have several sets of conclusions about the different parts of this talk. So there are many aspects of the interaction between the English, the Massachusetts, and the Wampanoag that involve subtle questions of historical interpretation. I am not going to deny that many of the colonists wrote and offered cruel interpretations of Indian epidemics. That is clear from the record. But if you focus only on those comments, you end up with an impoverished view of the history, which is actually much more complex and more interesting. While the cruelty of the colonial encounter is certainly a fact, there are also other facts about this encounter where there's evidence of empathy and compassion. So the question I'm interested in, well, what were the contexts that brought out these better sides of the human encounter? What were the aspects that were the forces that led to the cruel aspects of this encounter? And historians need to understand to strive for subtlety and nuance in their interpretations. And we should always be suspicious of simplistic accounts of complex episodes. Well, what about these claims that the indigenous societies were powerless in the face of European pathogens? The societies were left demoralized and lost faith in political and religious leaders. That may have happened in some places. It did not happen everywhere. Recent scholarship has tended to emphasize the perseverance and persistence and resilience of many of these communities despite the onslaught of colonization. There's a terrific book just out this fall by a Finnish historian, Pekka Hamalainen, who points out that North America, and not Eastern Massachusetts, but North America as a whole, remained largely an indigenous continent well into the 19th century. And so the notion that indigenous communities gave up the ghost the minute the English arrived, just is not sustained by the history. And of course, many indigenous groups remain in this country, remain throughout this country, despite the best efforts of many of these early colonists to push them aside. And then last is why should we care about these accounts of why so many Indians died? Why does virgin soil theory still matter to us? Well, one of the issue is now 400 years later, 500 years later, all sorts of health inequities continue to persist in this country. Whether you define populations by race or class or sex or any other marker of difference, you can see health inequalities. White Americans live longer than Black Americans. Rich people live longer than poor people. Women live longer than men. How do we account for these inequities? The stories that we tell about the past, the ways we explain what happened to the Indians often serve as precedents or justification for the stories that we tell about inequities now. If we dismiss these Indian pandemics as a simple fact of natural selection, a problem of genetic deficiencies, then it becomes easier to attribute the inequalities that exist today to similarly deterministic inevitable forces of race and genetics. But if you recognize that these past disparities reflected inequalities of wealth and power, then you can begin to recognize the ways in which the current disparities that we suffer from also reflect those inequalities of wealth and power that remain more impressive than ever in this country. And these questions of how we explain disparities affects how we respond to disparities. Are we empathic or are we judgmental? Are we simultaneously both empathic and judgmental, as many of these English colonists were in the 1630s? The recognition of the emotional complexity of past actors can help us appreciate our own. And only with that kind of insight can we hope to inspire more progressive responses to the problem of disease that persists today. So let me stop there. I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. So much to think about. I have a question, but I'm going to pass out some microphones so we can get some audience questions and also from Zoom. So one microphone is for Deirdre, who's going to read the Zoom questions. And Ruth, can you? Thank you. So one quick question as we get started, from some other history that we have studied as a group. I know that there was some efforts at inoculation that started very slowly in the 18th century during the Revolutionary War period. Was there any attempt at inoculation in the colonial days?
So as far as we can tell, the answer to that is likely no. There would have been inoculation had, as best as historians know. So this was a technique, not of vaccination, which uses cowpox to induce enduring protection against smallpox, but uses a gamble. You give someone smallpox deliberately in hopes of inducing a mild case, and then you end up with a lifelong immunity. And there may actually be some justification for that. There are reasons to believe if your first exposure to smallpox is through your skin, which is what would have happened with inoculation, then that would have been safer than if you had at first acquired the disease as an airborne viral pathogen. And so, the evidence that we have suggests that inoculation was actually a very good gamble, much safer than natural exposure to smallpox. It had been practiced in South Asia and East Asia for centuries, if not millennia, also in Africa as well. There's no expectation that it was practiced in the Americas, because as far as we know, there was no smallpox in the Americas before the Europeans brought it here. And the English, at least, first seemed to get news of inoculation in the late 17th century, so several decades after they arrived here. The Cotton Mather, who plays the villain role in this narrative, is one of the first English in the Americas to take it seriously. He reads about it in 1714 and then orchestrates the first use of inoculation in British America in 1720 in Boston. So they didn't have that technique. And so most of the accounts you see are, a lot of it just involves nursing care, keeping people warm, giving them something to drink, providing food. And there's certainly value in that kind of supportive care for people who have severe viruses. Later in the 18th century, you'll find the accounts in English medical texts of much more elaborate responses to smallpox that would have involved bleeding, purging, complex dietary regimens. But the English settlers in 1633 were, I think by anyone's standards, would have been quite poor. And many of them came from well-off communities in East Anglia, but they show up here with very little. And I don't think they had, in the early years, they didn't have the extensive pharmacopoeia that they would have been accustomed to in England, which left them with very limited options against smallpox. Even though in these early years, most of the attention has been on the mortality amongst the indigenous communities, you have to remember that mortality was extremely high amongst the English colonists. So of the 102 people who got off the Mayflower in Plymouth, half of them were dead by the end of the first winter. Of the 6,000 people who went to Jamestown before 1625, 80% of them died by 1625. So mortality rates were as high, if not higher, amongst the English in these early years than it was amongst the indigenous groups. The one thing that Massachusetts Bay Colony had going for it is they had 10 years of annual resupply from England before the English Revolution started. And so by 1640, they were well enough established to be self-sufficient. But inoculation doesn't show up until several decades later.
Thank you for that very complete response. So I know we have two questions on Zoom. Anyone want to kick it off in the audience here at the museum? Got a question over here?
as a historian, likely you rely on written accounts. So I'm wondering what sort of reliability, how you could avail yourself of the oral histories of the native peoples, because that has come up a lot in documentaries I've worked on.
So I don't know what the right answer is. I've spent a lot of time in my own historical work interviewing people now about what they were up to in the 1970s. And those testimonies are of quite limited value. And the best case is when you can find what these people at the time, what they were writing in the 1970s, and then compare that to what they've said now about what they thought in the 1970s. And so I'm often wary of that. There are many historians who are much more willing to take seriously oral traditions because those are the best records that we have. And one of the issues that comes up most often is and has become a conflict between archaeologists and many indigenous communities is you can find many oral testimonies, going back to the 1500s when the Spanish started writing these things down, of indigenous groups saying that the Americas before the Europeans arrived were a disease-free paradise. And that actually figures into some of these historical narratives. So historians will say, well, what happened is as again, this is the archaeologist's explanation, not the indigenous explanation, but the archaeologists will say, as human groups came from Asia across the Bering Sea into the Americas, they had to survive in Arctic environments, many of which are not conducive to the propagation of viral or bacterial pathogens. So there's this notion that the founding human populations had basically been sterilized from a disease point of view as they passed through the Arctic. And so the Americas were settled by a relatively disease-free human population. And that's why they were then so vulnerable when the Europeans showed up with their livestock and all their diseases. Many indigenous groups reject that notion of how the Americas were settled. They believe themselves to be indigenous to this land and not immigrants from Asia. And archaeologists have found plenty of disease in pre-Columbian skeletons. This was not a healthy place.
Deirdre, a couple of questions from Zoom.
Thank you. And using multiple technologies, we have our one of our Massachusetts tribal partners that is partnering with the museum, Elizabeth Solomon, on the phone. We're having some technical challenges. So I'm going to put my phone on speaker and allow Elizabeth to ask her question. Okay, we're going to try this. Elizabeth, you ready? Okay, 1 second. Okay, let's go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So my first comment is on the, let me mute my thing. Sorry, can you, I had to mute my
We're great.
speaker, so I didn't hear it on my computer and it reverberate back and forth and back and forth. So one of the things that I wanted to note right first off is the tendency that I feel that the author has to conflate conflate genetic protection with immunity. Those are two different things. So if genetic protection and immunity were the same, we would not be going through having inoculations for COVID as we are now. So there seems to be this pulling together of the idea of whether somebody has genetic protection, which there, as the author notes, that there is, that is the case for a number of diseases, and that takes place over a long period of time due to natural selection. But then there is also the idea of having immunity or reduced susceptibility due to exposure earlier. So I think I want to kind of make sure that those two things are understood to be different, and there seems to be a bit of conflating of that in the author's talk. The other thing that I wanted to say that I thought was really problematic is the idea of the conditions of colonization were the result, were what caused the increased mortality. However, in New England, the epidemics or pandemics that happened, all, for the most part, where there was so much loss of life, happened before colonization. So the major epidemics happened between 1616 and 1619. That is when most of the population perished. And so I really want to kind of say, like, the whole idea that, you know, that infant mortality in so that's one thing. And then the other thing that I was very concerned about is the premise that one can make a determination about the health of an indigenous population prior to colonization based on what we see in developing countries today, which are in fact in the position that they are because of colonization in the first place. So really kind of, and I feel there's a certain number of tropes that have happened there in terms of the idea of interpersonal violence, which plays into the idea of violent Indians, particularly violent Indian men. And so I'm really concerned about some of the conclusions that have been put forth by the author that I don't feel are really based on fact. I'm done. I want to give him a chance to respond.
Okay, so I'm happy to respond to all of those. So in the talk, I had tried to make clear, obviously wasn't fully successful, that those two mechanisms of genetic susceptibility and acquired susceptibility were wholly distinct. And I tried to provide evidence for why I'm skeptical of both of those. And I'm able to provide a much more detailed account of that in one of the articles that I had published, the one in William and Mary Quarterly, where I go through the scientific evidence. And there are roughly 5 distinct mechanisms that have been offered for why indigenous populations might have been more susceptible. And I'm able to go through the evidence for why there's good reason to be suspicious of all 5 of those. So I'm aware that there's a large difference between the mechanisms based on genetic immunity and adaptive or acquired immunity, but I'm not convinced by any of those. So there were 4 points. I'm not sure I'm going to get all 4 of them. The question about violence, the question towards the end, it's a really difficult one, trying to understand what conditions were like before the Europeans arrived. We have no written records. We do have oral testimony. And we also have archaeological evidence. The archaeological evidence and the oral testimony often don't line up. And so we're stuck navigating a difficult evidence space. As I said, across the Americas, there's evidence of population decline between 1400 and 1500. Or I don't know if we have high enough resolution to be confident that that was also true in southern New England. And we also, from reports, again, everything that we have that's written was written by the English. There does seem to have been hostility between the New England groups. One of the reasons that Massasoit was interested in forming an alliance with the colonists at Plymouth is because he had been engaged in hostilities with the Narragansett tribe. And so he saw the Plymouth colonists as a possible ally against the Narragansett. And so I'm not imposing my own tropes of violence there. I'm just trying to capture what was described to the English as they were trying to navigate the politics of these groups that existed there previously. In terms of the analogy, trying to understand what the health of pre-modern populations like anywhere is incredibly difficult. There are some diseases, tuberculosis, syphilis, severe infections that do leave marks on the skeleton, but most of the things that kill us don't mark the skeleton at all. If anyone digs up graveyards of people who died from COVID, they will find no traces on the skeleton of COVID. Now we have genetic technology that can allow these sorts of things to be figured out. But most diseases are diseases of our soft tissues and are not well preserved in the archaeological record. So if you wanted to say, what were the leading causes of death in the Americas before 1492? We know that tuberculosis was present. We know that a disease like syphilis was present. We know that osteomyelitis, bacterial infections of bones, was present. Beyond that, it's really a blank slate. There's a lot of research now trying to use DNA evidence. It's very difficult to do in the United States because for very good reasons, archaeologists don't have access to Indian burial sites. Traditionally, they had. That has been recognized as a problem. And many museums that hold the remains of indigenous and other kinds of humans are doing their best, not perfectly, but are trying to give these remains back instead of continuing to study them. And so we can either say we have no idea what happened to these people, or we can try to make comparisons to people who live in conditions, in rural conditions, and say, well, the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts were living in rural conditions here. Maybe there's something we can learn from analogies of people living in rural conditions in other parts of the world. That's certainly not a perfect analogy. You're totally right that the conditions we see now in many rural populations are populations that have been disrupted by colonization. But again, one thing they can figure out from the bony remains is how long life expectancies were. When you see communities in the Southwest US where life expectancies were under 20, there must have been something affecting these people to have them live such a short time. The communities in the pre-contact Americas that seem to have the healthiest lives and the longest lives were in coastal Georgia. People who live there seem to have been healthier than Europeans at the same time, with life expectancies into the 60s. So health conditions varied enormously across the Americas. But we're really left with not all the information we'd like to have. And so you have various mechanisms you can use to speculate. And so it's important to acknowledge what is and what is not speculation. As I said, the basic question, how many people lived, how many people died? We don't know that. And everything, a lot of the uncertainty follows from there. And I apologize, I think there was a fourth point that I have lost track of.
When most of the deaths.
Oh, sorry, when most of the deaths occurred. So yes, that's a really interesting question. Again, the answers there vary. So there are parts of what's now the United States where we have very good evidence of this. And so in the Southeast and the Southwest, we have the best records. And those two places, the bulk of the mortality was well after European colonization. For local history, coastal Massachusetts, the epidemic of 1616 to 1619 is the one that gets lots of attention. It does seem to be the case that where the Plymouth colonists set up shop was on an abandoned site, a Wampanoag site, the village of Patuxent. The challenge there for historians in terms of the written record is everything we know about the epidemic of 1616 to 1619 comes down to 3 sentences that have been written by different authors. And they make these very large claims of mortality. And it's very hard to know, most of them were not direct observers. It's very hard to know what to make if someone says, like, Cushman, a 20th person is scarce left alive. Do we take that as a true statement? He had no basis for being able to make an estimate like that. He did not do surveys. He didn't know what the pre-contact populations were. He didn't know what the post-contact populations were. It was not even a back of the envelope comment. It was a throwaway comment. But we only have 3 such statements. And then historians have built this elaborate apparatus around it. There's other testimony. As I said, you can find the accounts of unburied bones. Most archaeologists and anthropologists assume that if you find a human settlement where bones were left unburied, something very wrong must have happened there, because most human societies are pretty fastidious about proper care for the deceased. Are the accounts of mortality because of an epidemic? Could there have been famines? The famine I mentioned, the terrible smallpox epidemic I mentioned, 1837, 1838, occurred in the setting of a famine. So to what extent this was new exposure of the Mandan and Arikara to smallpox, or was this smallpox hitting a population that was already marginally, struggling to subsist in the setting of a famine? Most of the pandemics in early Massachusetts, we don't know the timing of 1616 to 1619, because again, we know almost nothing about that. We do know that epidemic of 1633-34 ran December, January, February. It doesn't take that much for any of us here to imagine what nutritional conditions would have been like for anyone living in New England in the early 1630s. Many of the indigenous communities describe the winters as the dying time. That was certainly the experience of the English. As I said, half the people in Plymouth died that first winter. The fact that you see very high mortality at that time of year, I suspect is no coincidence. And again, but you're right that there is this mystery. What might have happened in 1616 and 1619? It did occur before settlement, but didn't occur before contact. Several groups had been famously raided by the English. Captives had been taken back to England. If other colonists behaved the way that the Plymouth settlers did, they might have raided caches of Indian crops. One of the first things that the Pilgrims do when they're exploring Cape Cod is they find caches of Indian corn, which they commandeer and take for themselves. If the earlier settlers and explorers had been doing that, it is possible that these communities could have been put under stress before the main arrival of the English in 1620 and 1630.
Thank you, David. Much that we don't know clearly, and thank you for your thoughtful response. Next question from Zoom.
Thank you. I'm always encouraging my students to make connections in our history class. And I will first thank you for your lecture. I'd love to hear what anecdotes or stories or statistics from COVID-19 gave you an aha moment of connection, if any, that you would share with us.
Yeah. And many of them. I had spent many years reading accounts of other people's epidemics, having never lived through one myself. And now having lived through one myself, I read all of these things slightly differently. I think the biggest regret I had is I've been talking about the early New England epidemics here, but one of the other case studies in my book describes the Navajo epidemic, the tuberculosis epidemic that struck the Navajo really in the mid-20th century, the 1920s and 1950s. And one of the things that was so puzzling for the federal government was coming to believe that a population like the Navajo could have a severe problem with tuberculosis. Tuberculosis had classically been seen as a disease of crowded European cities. So it was very much an urban phenomenon. When people in Boston or New York got sick with tuberculosis, they were often told to go west. And so by the late 19th century, there were a whole series of health resorts, Palm Springs, Colorado Springs, El Paso, Texas. All these were founded by essentially people crippled by respiratory disease who were fleeing the Northeast, going to high arid desert climates, which was thought to be good places for people who have bad lungs. And based on those assumptions, when reports started to come out that there was a severe epidemic of tuberculosis amongst the Navajo, it was quickly discounted because that just doesn't make any sense. The Southwest is exactly where you should go to recover from tuberculosis. It doesn't make sense that they have tuberculosis. And so for decades, there was very little federal action against this. And so the epidemic persists well into the 1950s. And it took concerted effort by a whole series of activists and collaborations between white researchers and Navajo leaders to put this epidemic on the agenda of the federal government and mobilize the resources needed. And but anyway, it was quite clear by the time the dust had settled on this, the communities like the Navajo, even living in the high desert arid Southwest, when the conditions are, as I say, just right, but when conditions are just wrong, can suffer terribly from a respiratory disease like tuberculosis. Fast forward to the winter of 2020, when COVID first strikes the US, it's New York City that gets most of the attention. It behaved like a typical urban disease. And one of my great regrets as a historian was that in February and March, I never raised my hand to say, we need to be careful because history has shown that these kinds of diseases can also affect rural populations. Respiratory diseases aren't simply an urban problem. And so in April 2020, when the first reports started coming out of a dire outbreak of COVID on the Navajo reservation, that's when I had a very sad aha moment. The same thing was happening again. Even a community that at first pass might have seemed like it would be relatively low risk for a crowd disease like COVID was actually at quite high risk. And some of you may have seen the reports of life expectancy coming out from the CDC. Life expectancy of everyone living in the United States is down by 3 years, from 79 to 76 over the past 3 years. Life expectancy is down by twice that amongst American Indians and Alaska Natives. That's not entirely because of COVID. There are many things that are driving those decreases in life expectancy. But many indigenous communities in the United States had a terrible time with COVID. And many observers responded by being surprised that a disease like COVID could cause problems in rural areas. But that's exactly what happened with tuberculosis. And I wish I had thought, and I wish others had thought to think of that earlier in the epidemic.
I'm struck by there being more available research on Cherokees than New England natives. Is there research available on early European settlers' effect on natives of the Mid-Atlantic and Southeastern areas? Fascinating presentation. Thank you.
So it's a mix of factors that determine, when we have good records. It depends on basically when the timing of the epidemics are. So many of the first epidemics, many of the first severe epidemics struck Alaska in the 1940s when they built the Trans-Alaska Highway during World War II. And so we have very good records of what happened in Alaska in 1940. There were terrible epidemics in California in the 18th century at a time when the Spanish Empire was exerting a very strong colonizing presence, especially through churches on the indigenous communities in California. And churches, if they did nothing else, they kept very detailed records of births and deaths. And so there's been tremendous research using church records of the demographics of indigenous communities in California in the 18th century. And similarly, we have good records of the Pueblo epidemics in the 1630s to the 1660s, again, because the Spanish, especially the Spanish churches, were quite fastidious at keeping records. The Cherokee, a lot of the mortality was in the 18th century. There were better mechanisms. The levels of historical preservation are higher for documents from the 18th century than the 17th century. The Cherokee quickly developed their own written language and start keeping track of their own sources as well. And so the Cherokee in the 18th century are quite well documented. As I said before, for 1616 to 1619, there was not a settled English presence yet. There are travelers' accounts. There are retrospective accounts by the English. There's one, people have been trying to figure out what this epidemic might have been. And a lot of people have said it might be hepatitis. Why do they think the 1616 epidemic was hepatitis? Because Daniel Gookin, who was the Massachusetts Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1670, 50 years after the fact, interviewed some survivors who had been children at the time. And one of them said the person turned yellow before he passed away. And so, yes, if you have hepatitis, your skin can turn yellow from jaundice. Does that mean this epidemic in 1616 was hepatitis because one person 50 years later said they remembered someone turning yellow? That's a very thin evidence base to draw strong conclusions. The English, as I said, eventually, in a half-hearted way, get involved in the process of missionizing. And so you can find very detailed accounts in the writings of John Eliot and Thomas Mayhew, especially from what's now Martha's Vineyard, what was then Kapalak. But we just don't have good records of we have essentially no records of what happened in 1616. We have very thin records of what happened in 1633. And that's a combination both of the English not being as bureaucratic as the Spanish or even the French were in Quebec, and these being earlier, sort of more remote points in history. So for instance, to give you an example, one of the things I most wanted to find in all of my research in graduate school was the diary of Samuel Maverick. He settled what's now Logan Airport, more or less, East Boston, in 1625. And at the time, he was there with his family, a very small number of English. Most of his social interactions would have been with the local Massachusetts community. He had been there for 8 years, living intimately with the indigenous communities for 8 years before the epidemic of 1633 strikes. So my speculation was that he might have written quite differently about the epidemic of 1633 than people like John Winthrop, who were relative strangers in the vicinity by the time this happened. And most of John Winthrop's social circles were English, and 1,000 people showed up in Boston in 1630, and that becomes a very closed social circle. So I was all set to go forth and find the diary of Samuel Maverick to see if he wrote differently about it. And wasn't having much success. So I went and made the pilgrimage to the office of Bernard Bailyn, who was a very famous professor of colonial American history at Harvard. And he said, look, David, what you have to understand is that people in Massachusetts became obsessed with their history in the 19th century. You start to see the publication of the historical collections of the Massachusetts Historical Society, volume after volume after volume. Every scrap of paper that survives from Massachusetts from the 17th century was found in the 19th century. You're not going to find some unopened box in someone's attic and stumble across the diary of Samuel Maverick. I don't know if that's true, but he was a pretty good authority. And so it was expedient for me as a graduate student to say, Bernard Bailyn says the diary doesn't exist, and so I will stop looking for it. And so there's a lot of stuff we would like to know, but we just simply can't know. He did later in his life, I think in the 1650s, write a bit of an autobiographical statement where he doesn't mention the epidemic at all. So it's very frustrating. So there are lots of things I would like to know that we just simply don't know.
More questions from our in-room audience? Roy?
Thank you. Yeah, just fascinating, but I'm always interested in the kind of the opposite side of things. I had a big problem as a history student for that reason. I'm wondering that the whole element of the assumption or the feeling that this was a blessing from God. Did you find exceptions from this anywhere? Were there some settlers, and we covered mainly English, so I'm glad you touched on the Spanish a little bit too. But I'm wondering if you found cases where there was not that connection between God being on our side, wiping out the people that they encountered.
So two things. So one, Calvinist theology is very hard for non-Calvinists to wrap their heads around. And I spent a lot of time reading these diaries. The one that was most moving to me was the diary of Thomas Shepard, who was the first minister in Cambridge. And his diary has been transcribed in this commentary, I think it was by Michael Winship. And he writes about the death of one of his children. And he is able to spin the narrative enough that he sees the death of his child as a blessing from God, because by taking his child away from him, God had reminded him that he had gotten too attached to worldly possessions and had properly refocused Shepard's attention on the spiritual realm. So Shepard saw the death of his child as a providential blessing. When Winthrop writes that it was a providential blessing that the Indians died, there are many possible explanations, but he says directly, it clears the way for us. So I'm not trying to let him off the hook. I'm just trying to say that we can't fully understand what were in these people's hearts and minds, because it was a very different, I mean, it's eerie. A lot of their belief system is quite resonant with us. The congregational churches that still dot the Massachusetts countryside are the descendants of the Calvinist Church of the Massachusetts Bay Company. The theology is quite different now than it was then. In terms of the other colonists, I spent a lot of time looking at Dutch records. They were in upstate New York on the Hudson and Mohawk River Valley at the time of the epidemic of 1633, 1634. They don't write so much. Mostly they were frustrated because it disrupted the fur supply. And so they just saw it as a loss of revenue. The Spanish tended to write more, even though again, very different religious context, the Spanish Catholic Church, their writing is actually quite reminiscent of the English, full of providential explanations, different notions of providence, but God was killing these people, part of justification to their mission. It became a bit of an anxiety to the Spanish because one of their goals was to convert and save these souls that had not yet been saved. And so a lot of the Spanish explorers would count up how many people they had converted, and that was their credit sheet. And so they were competing to see who had converted the most. And there are many accounts of Mexican Catholicism in the 17th century that were Catholic in name only. These were essentially indigenous rituals that were barely inflected by Catholicism, but they were still counted as converts by the Spanish. It's the French who have really seen the most regret most of the people who are writing from the French were the Jesuit missionaries who were sent from Paris to Montreal, Quebec, along the Great Lakes. And some of them, and again, these were highly educated, learned people. Many of them had been Jesuit missionaries in other parts of the world. So they had been out and about more than the average person in the 17th century. And they were quite concerned by the reports they were hearing from the Huron, especially, that mortality had increased dramatically after they had arrived. And so they were wondering what it was that they had done. To what should they feel guilty or take responsibility for what was happening? And so you can see the angst that they're feeling about this, but it never actually reached the threshold for them to do anything about it. They just continued business as usual, but they were clearly worried and introspective about that in a way I haven't seen in the English.
Portuguese were a lot like the Spanish, I presume.
I haven't looked at the records in Brazil, but I assume it was quite similar. The Portuguese, unlike the Spanish, weren't encountering highly sophisticated societies in the way that the Spanish found in Mexico and Peru. And so most of the early Portuguese history, and there are accounts of interactions with the communities that were dispersed throughout the Amazon Valley, but much more the Portuguese attention was focused on enslaving people and bringing them in.
I believe we have one more question on Zoom and one more in the room, and that might, well, we'll try and do two more in the room.
Would you be willing to compare providence and Christian superiority then to wealth and power today?
So it's a tricky issue, right? It's often tempting to try to impose frameworks to simplify complex phenomena. And so if you do that, you could say, look, if you are faced with a health inequity, one group living longer than the other group, there are three basic types of explanations you can give. You can say that the problem is intrinsic, and the people who are dying at higher rates, there's something wrong with them, which is why they're dying at higher rates. You can say it's behavioral. These people are doing something in a way that's bringing the disease on. Or you could say it's structural. There's something in society that is generating these kinds of epidemics. And one of the things that's interesting is you can find examples of all three modes of those explanations in any century that you can look. You can find them in the 17th century, the 18th century, 19th century, and the 20th century. In the 20th and the 21st centuries, when you're trying to find explanations that seem like they're attributing responsibility to some intrinsic factor of the people at the wrong end of an inequity, most of those explanations are genetic. You can find accounts, rigorous medical accounts of indigenous susceptibility to smallpox, tuberculosis, pneumococcal infections, heart disease, alcoholism, cancer, mental illness, in most major forms of disease. And you can find exactly the same thing in the literature about Black-white disparities in this country. So you can find people who have speculated about genetic mechanisms for all those categories of disease. And if you put all those things together, you should realize that you're in a very uncomfortable situation, because what you're arguing is that white Europeans are genetically more resilient to every category of disease than all other humans, which most people would say is just a white supremacist statement. There's no way that's true. It doesn't make any sense. So if that conclusion is unreasonable, how many steps should you be taking back before being so enthusiastic about those kinds of genetic explanations for these disparities? Now, obviously, in the 17th century, there were notions of heritability that map very loosely on what we might call genetics. But most of the accounts of intrinsic susceptibility in the 17th century would have been couched in religious terms. The English had no doubt that their religion was the right religion. The reason, and it wasn't just a question of Christianity versus other things, it was about particular forms of Christianity. The reason that the Pilgrims came to Plymouth and the reason the Mass Bay Colony came here is because they were invested in their particular form of Protestantism, which was inconsistent with the Anglican Church. So they had fled here because of their commitment to their religious faith. The people they encountered were not Calvinist Protestants. They had a whole host of different indigenous religions, none of which were well received by the English. So many, you'll find many accounts attributing disease states to the fact that the indigenous groups were described as heathens, savages, devil worshippers, goes on and on and on. So is there some analogy? So both of these explanations, religious explanations, genetic explanations, fall into that bucket of blaming intrinsic factors of the population. Is there some analogy between them? Obviously, religious explanations and genetic explanations are quite different, but both of them tend to absolve the healthier group from any kind of responsibility to intervene. Wasn't the fault of the dominant group that these people had this disease? It's either genetic liability or spiritual liability. And so I think there is a parallel between those two kinds of explanation.
So we're running over our normal time, but I want to get a few more questions in. So if you could ask your questions as quickly, condense them as much as you can. We've got a few more in the room. Ruth?
I'll give shorter answers.
Hi, my name is Paul Lasoto. I just finished rereading the David Horowitz book, Forest Wars, which goes 1620, 1776. It's short, but it's pretty well researched. It supports in almost every instance what you're saying, the genocidal wars against the Pequots and Narragansett, real direct, they might rise, they're not risen, but, surround the village, burn it, kill the women, children, and men as they run out. Pretty simple. The sad letter of the Wampanoags before 1675, where they say, you've hemmed us in, they're down in Mount Hope down in Rhode Island. They said we used to control all this area, which would be Bristol and, and Plymouth County and Barnstable. Now they just control small areas. Your cattle trample our corn and file clam beds. Obviously, that means that they survive. The Huron, the Iroquois getting the guns and tomahawks from the Dutch in Albany, and they decimate the Hurons, not because of their usual intertribal warfare, because they want to control the fur trade through the St. Lawrence Valley, which wasn't their area. 10,000 Hurons are on the island of Christian Island and Lake Huron, and the Jesuits document all of them dying except 500 and cannibalism. So those all support that indirect effect of Europeans on the native population. The one that doesn't is Jeffrey Amherst, the general that's under controversy now because of the naming of the Lord Jeffs at great institution, Amherst College. Jeffrey Amherst writes a letter to his Western commander, since they're not doing very well in Pontiac's war in 1763, after Detroit has fallen and what's now Pittsburgh has fallen. Why don't you send write in a letter, why don't you send us some smallpox blankets among the natives? And it seems to have worked. Now, I don't know if there's other factors involved that about where they've been running around like King Philip's troops were after a year and a half, and they're not, they're so disrupted that they're not as strong as they look, but they look like they're on a roll. And suddenly they're both their population collapses and their, and it's generally attributed to smallpox as well as other people leaving the Confederacy. So I didn't know if you were familiar with that episode.
Yeah, so there's Amherst's letter. It's a complicated story. I'll try to be brief. I'll say two things. First, whether or not it worked is a area of disagreement amongst historians. Some people have said, so that the Amherst expresses his intent that smallpox be spread. Amherst wasn't actually in contact with the garrison at Pittsburgh or Fort Pitt, because the Fort Pitt was besieged. The local trader and captain who were in charge at Fort Pitt independently got the same idea to try to spread smallpox. So this is in June of 1763. Over the next year, there was smallpox amongst the indigenous communities of Western Pennsylvania. So some people have said that's proof that smallpox spread by these blankets to the local community. Smallpox was always spreading in 17th century. So the fact that there was smallpox 6 months later in Western Pennsylvania doesn't mean it came from what happened at Fort Pitt. And the much more proximate evidence is that the Shawnee and Delaware, who the blankets were given to, were still laying siege 6 weeks later. And they came back to parley repeatedly in June and July with the English, and they themselves never leveled an accusation. Now, in the 18th century, it was routine for indigenous groups to accuse the Europeans of having spread smallpox. Accusations of smallpox, of deliberate spread of infection go back to the 1580s at Roanoke, 1620s at Plymouth. And so it's quite common. So if indigenous groups thought that they had been deliberately infected, they often let the Europeans know this concern. You don't see that in the 6 weeks after the things were given. And so I'm skeptical that the attack worked. But from my point of view, whether or not it worked or not, it's not the question. The issue is that multiple levels of the British command thought it was an appropriate thing to do. And there's no doubt about that. However, and so a lot of people have said that such a horrible thing could only have occurred in the context of a frontier race war. That's clearly not true. George Washington was convinced when he was sitting on the north side of the Charles River in the winter of 1775, 1776, that the British were inoculating people with smallpox in Boston and shipping them across the river as refugees as part of a deliberate attack on Washington's army. When they had besieged the British at Yorktown, the British expelled a lot of the Africans who had been forced to fight for the British, many of whom had smallpox. Washington at Yorktown assumes that the British were deliberately infecting these Africans with smallpox, sending them across the siege lines to infect the Continental Army. There were concerns about deliberate infection between the French and the Germans, French and the British at Halifax during the 7 Years' War. As gruesome as it is, deliberate infection with smallpox seems to have been considered fair game in European warfare in the 1760s, 1770s. What happened at Fort Pitt is gruesome, but doesn't seem to have been any different than what was considered ethical conduct of warfare by the British and the French in the 1760s, 1770s.
We have one quick question that we can fit in. Okay. Thank you all for the really fascinating questions, and thank you, David. I believe our speaker is willing to spend a little time with us in the reception, and we do have some signed copies of his books for those of you who may want to purchase one. There were also some other titles that came up on the slides, and for those of you who are interested, we can get that information out to you following today's lecture. So thank you, Dr. Jones, for that as well. My main takeaway from today is that to question things that we have learned as fact based on centuries old occurrences, and also to just be more thoughtful in general, I think, about history. And certainly you've raised lots of questions and given us some really thoughtful ways to approach what we don't know. So thank you for that. I wanted to thank our audience on Zoom for joining us today. A couple of shout outs to people who were helpful in putting this program together. Colin McGinnis again for the technical expertise. Our education committee members for volunteering, those who greeted and took your ticket information as you checked in. Laura, who stepped in for Jane Shute, who sadly is a little bit ill at the moment. And we have a wonderful reception in store, I'm sure, because Laura does a wonderful job. Before we end our Zoom program, I want everyone to know that our next program is January 22nd. It's our 4th program in this series, and our speaker, Virginia Anderson. You heard some reference to a future program about how domestic animals coming from Europe had an impact on the lives of Native people and their landscape, and that's what the subject will be. Virginia has just retired as professor of history at the University of Colorado, and she will be sharing her insights from Boulder, Colorado. Should be fascinating. Also, those of you who are with us in the museum, and we have a really nice group today, thank you all for coming out. We'd like to have you join us on the 2nd floor, where we have refreshments and copies of the book. And with that, we can end our Zoom program, and thank you very much.